Hi everybody, my name is Larsen. In this video I want to show you how you can use different tools to reharmonize a standard. So I'm going to take a part of the song All Things You Are, then I'm going to go over 5 different reharmonizations, talk about how they work, how they're connected, using really from tritone substitution and other sort of pretty common devices, tonal devices, into something that's more atonal, and then talk a little bit about the logic that you still kind of need to have in there when you're using reharmonizations like that. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, about improvising over changes and checking out interesting arpeggios and scales, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. That was the first 8 bars of All Things You Are, and that's what I'm going to use as an example throughout this video. So I'm just going to reharmonize these 8 bars in different ways and talk about how that works and how you can make your own reharmonizations on this song and of course on any other song that you want to work with. I took All Things You Are because it's a song that a lot of people know, and probably you want to keep in mind that when you're working with reharmonizations, you're still playing the melody, really. So the idea is here that we're trying to find a way to play the melody and give some color to the melody, and you also somehow kind of assume very often that the one listening already knows the melody, and that's a little bit what's sort of making it possible to do this, because otherwise then if you don't know the melody, then you're just left with a really strange vague jazz composition. But if you do know the melody, then your ear expects certain things in certain places, and that's kind of what's giving the effect of the reharmonization. That's what makes it work for a lot of the listeners that's going to be listening to this. Another thing that I think is important to point out is that we are working with harmonizing a melody, so I don't think it makes too much sense to just reduce the song to chords and then just start changing the chords without thinking about how that sounds with the melody, because most of the time, I mean, of course you can reharmonize it and then also start working with changing the melody. That it's not that it's not possible, but I think it's often it's just a good idea to really still hear this as a way of playing the melody, and then you might as well, if you're reharmonizing it, make something that works with the melody and then use that for the rest of the piece as well. This first reharmonization is relying mostly on pretty standard techniques that you'll come across in jazz all the way back to hard bop. That means that I'm using some tritone substitutions, some chains of dominance, and then at the end I also use a Lydian augmented sound on the major 7 chord, which is maybe a little bit more pointing towards a more modern sound. Just to quickly cover what is really happening in All Things You Are. So All Things You Are is, in the beginning, is an A flat. And it starts on the 6th degree, and then 2, and then to the 5, 1, and then 4, and then here it adds a G7, which you would expect to go to C minor, but it goes in fact to C major, so we modulate to the major 3rd, which is also a fairly common thing to do in a jazz standard. So that's the basic changes in All Things You Are. So it works a lot with that. It keeps on moving, and it's moving within the scale, so it's just moving in actually fifths through the scale, and then suddenly ends up in another key, and that's sort of the basic construction, and that's also what's still happening here. I didn't really break up that kind of feel to it, so it's still just moving. I'm actually just accelerating or giving the movement a little bit more direction than just the diatonic movement, because what's happening here is the first chord, the F minor, so I have the A flat in the melody, and that works really well. If I, instead of playing an F minor, I could play an F7 altered, but here I'm playing now a B7, so it will be sort of a B7 Lydian dominant, and then move that up to, instead of the B flat minor, an E7, also a Lydian dominant, and then let's see, I think I played the 2-5, so on the E flat 7, that's really replaced with E minor 7, A7, and then I go to A flat to resolve that. So we expect to hear diatonic chords, and they are replaced with these tritone substituted dominants and then a tritone 2/5. And then for the rest, the D flat and the G7 are the same, and then on the C major 7, I turn it into like a Lydian augmented sound, which is kind of introduced gradually. And all these different chords are just options that really work well with the melody. The Lydian augmented sound works really well because you have an E on the C major 7, and whenever you have that, then you're pretty free to just decide to make it Lydian or even like a major 7 sharp 5 type of chord, and that helps a lot. You probably don't want to mess too much with the C major 7 right away, because a surprising ending already in itself. So if you mess with it, you might actually end up with something that's a little bit weaker than what is already there. That can also be something to be aware of when you're reharmonizing. Of course, there are many things you can do with these basic tritone substitutions and making things into dominants. I'm not going to cover too much more of it, because I kind of assume that if you're checking out this video, you're already pretty familiar with those options. One thing that is worth mentioning about this arrangement or this harmonization is that this will actually work in a solo as well, because you're really playing something that has a very strong direction. You can just start using these changes in the chorus and then have something that it may or may not clash depending on who's company you. It might clash a little bit with what's happening behind you, but you're coming back home in a really logical way, and it's easy to hear on top of the real changes because it kind of follows the same kind of logic as what is originally there. And you'll also find that Metheny usually does this once or twice if he's playing a solo on All the Things You Are. In this reharmonization, I'm already just leaving the original movement of the progression completely behind and starting to do something else. The good thing about All the Things You Are is that it doesn't have really a lot of melody notes, so for each chord there's only going to be like 1, maybe 2 notes, and that makes it a little bit easier to mess around with. What you will be doing is probably sort of put in some sort of puzzle that you can find a set of chords that will work together, and then the chords should have some sort of logic. In this case, what I'm doing is, instead of having this F minor 7, then if I want to have another sound at that place and I still want to have something that it should sound different, but it should still just sound like it's really supposed to be there. It shouldn't be a very strange or sound with any kind of tension. Then a major 7 chord is a really good option for that. And that's also what I'm doing here. So I just start with a D flat major 7 with the A flat in the melody, and that's really just almost just another bass note on the F minor 7. But I'm using that as a sort of logic, because then the next chord that I want to play is again a major 7 chord. So I'm using the fact that we're just using a very consonant sound and then moving that around. And in this instance, I'm actually moving it around in major thirds, which is kind of giant steps like, which gives it a sort of logic that's also going to make the progression as a whole work a little bit better. So the next chord is going to be A major 7. So I'm moving down in major thirds to F major 7, and then on to a D flat major 7. This time the D flat major 7 gets to be a Lydian chord, but in the logic of just moving around with these kind of voicings, because it's sort of a sound that we're used to from giant steps, and actually also just the whole connection in major thirds is actually something that's already in our ears from songs also, like like All the Things You Are, that modulates up a major third, and also Have You Met Miss Jones. There are a lot of songs that do that, so it's some sort of connection that makes sense to us that isn't as obvious as if we're playing just a chain of like a cycle of fifths kind of motion. So that's what the principle is here. And then because I'm ending on the D flat, then in the original song in bar 5 I would have a D flat major 7. I can't really put that in there now, so I just changed that into a D minor, and then in that way modulate to C major. That would be one option, one way of dealing with that. Of course, here I'm using major thirds and I'm not really in the key of A flat, but you can actually apply the real Coltrane cycle to this song as well. Then you will get something like this. another way of introducing this element of a surprising sound, and it has to be kind of predictable, but at the same time it has to sound like it's surprising and that we can't really tell what's going on. The only thing we can tell is that it isn't tonal. So it's probably going to sound tonal if the bass line is resolving in a sort of predictable way, in the sense that it's moving in resolving down a fifth or moving down chromatically. That becomes really predictable, and we're used to having that already in tonal music. But using the major thirds is one way of working with it. Another way is to have an ascending bass line, because that is predictable. We can really hear, we expect what the next note in the bass will be, but we don't know what the color of the chord will be, because there's not really any sort of tonal connection that we're going to work with unless you have a dim chord there. That's what I'm using in this arrangement. So the idea is that I have a bass line that's moving up in half steps, and then I play that under the melody, like. So that's kind of the logic that's happening here, is that we have this movement that we can predict, and that you quickly start to hear, okay, we're expecting that to keep on going, and then of course we know the melody, and then I'm just adding colors in between, and that becomes not random, but that's really just down to what you think sounds nice. So in this case I'm really just starting on a D7 also chord, really like this, and then moving up to an E flat minor chord, which is somewhat related. They're similar in sound, but the bass is moving, and this is more for the Dorian sound. And then here we get an E minor chord, which is just moving parallel. F7. I think really you could have used an F minor here as well. I think I just went for the F7 because I want to have another type of chord sound there. If you move too much in parallel chords with the same type of chord, then it gets too predictable or too boring. So you want to sort of change that up a bit. I could have probably used a major 7 as well. This is, again, when you're in this area, then it's like you have to balance it out and really just try and see what works and what you think sounds better in that respect. So E minor, and then the F7, and then of course G flat with an F in the melody, so that's in this case a major 7 chord. We know what the melody sounds like, we know what the bass sounds like, and then the chord sound has to kind of be a surprise compared to what we normally expect at that place in the song. That's really what's carrying this type of harmonization, and that's also what's happening here. So we get the G flat major 7 with the major 7 in the melody, and then actually back to the original with the G7 with the F in the melody. And that's also because the melody here is the tritone, so we have the F and the B, and there are not that many things that we can use in terms of different chords that will work for that one. So the G7 is just always a good option. And then in this case I decided also, because it's anyway relying on you knowing already what the melody is, to change the last chord and then make it even brighter than what the C major is. And I do that by using an A major at the end. I think if you saw some of the other videos I did on reharmonizations, this is something I do quite often. When you have a C major chord with a third in the melody, just a sustained third, then you can also just look at, well, the third can be something else. And one of the things that work really well is to have it as the fifth in a major 7 chord. And one reason why that's also practical is because very often if you have a C major with a third in the melody, it's preceded by a G7, and G7 is the backdoor dominant in A major. So in that way, that progression is going to make sense as well. This arrangement is kind of similar to the previous one in the sense that it's fairly atonal. There's no real relation between the different chords. Everything is just moving and probably being justified by, one, the color of the melody, and two, just the sort of predictability of the bass line. At the same time, now I also changed the harmonic rhythm. So in the original song, we have 1 chord per bar, and that's pretty much what it's going to be. We might turn like a dominant into a 2/5, but for the rest, it's really just staying with the same just 1 chord per bar idea. And here, now I'm really starting to move the chords twice as fast, which also means that I can't have the same kind of idea that I have, for instance, like the ascending bass line that I'm using here, but I'm kind of using it twice. I need to break it up and use 2 phrases for this, because if you have like one ascending bass line, then it's going to be too much, it's not going to work. So the phrase needs to work in a little bit of a different way, and you have to make variation or an ending to a sentence to get it to work, in my opinion anyway. I'm starting with, again, my A flat here, and then now I chose to make it a part of an A major 7 chord. And then I just start working with how it would be to move up chromatically here, so. And then this way of playing where I'm just basically moving the whole chord up, which is going from A major 7 to B flat 7, works quite well. And then the next is a B minor to C7. And it really, the C7 is just because, well, we have a flat 9 and a flat 13 in the melody, so that's not so much choice really. Moving into D flat major 7, D minor, and then a B flat 7. The D flat 7 becomes sort of a conclusion of the first ascending chromatic idea in the harmony, and then the second line I start on the B. And then I'm using actually what is similar to the D flat to D, so it's a B7 to C minor 7 to D flat 7. I have the F and the B in the melody, so I'm using the D flat 7 for that. That works. And then because I want to go to a B flat chord at the in bar, what's that, bar 7, I actually add a dominant for that one, and that's a B7, which is like a tritone dominant, so, and then the F in the melody, and then down to the Lydian sound on this B flat major 7, flat 5 or sharp 11, or how you want to hear it. What I'm hoping that this demonstrates is that if you're thinking more in terms of the atonal sounds and just trying to put some interesting chords onto the melody, because you can do a lot of stuff in tonal harmony where you start using substitutions as well. And of course, I've already made a lot of videos on all the options you have in C major and stuff like that. You can check that out, and you can use all those options, and then you can get it to make sense in sort of a tonal way. But at the same time, when you use sort of more the atonal, just colors under the melody, then you need something else to make sense. I think for me, most of the time that has to do with sort of the bassline movement or parallel movement of chords, or using, so that would be moving around the same type of sound for several bars. But you do need some kind of logic, and as you can tell also with this last example, you have to treat that as a phrase. So you also have to be aware of how long that's going to make sense, because if you keep on going, it's just becoming sort of this predictable trick that keeps on moving through the whole song, and it becomes sort of a music box type arrangement, and that doesn't really work that well. So even if the harmony is completely atonal, you still need to think in terms of length of sentence and length of phrase with your progressions. And normally when you're playing tonal harmony, you kind of have like cadences and stuff like that to take care of it, and you don't really have that here, but you do want to take stuff like that into consideration to make a reharmonization that's really going to make sense. This is a small peek into how I work with reharmonization and how I treat the melody, and also how I definitely keep the melody in mind all the time. And hopefully you can use that. I'm of course curious also to hear how you work with reharmonizations. Do you make your own arrangements of standards? Do you mess around with this? And do you only work with tonal harmony? Do you also work with just putting chords together? And do you have a method or some ideas that maybe there's something that you found out that I didn't talk about? So if you have something to add to that discussion, which I think is an interesting discussion to have also, because it's not so common really. There are not so many people talking about this kind of harmony and what works. I think you probably only find that in like composition classes. So if you have something to add, then leave a comment on this video. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, and it's the first time you see one of my videos, then subscribe to my channel. The videos that I publish here every week are on finding some solid methods and good strategies to check out music theory and interesting things about improvising jazz guitar. If you like this video and you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. I'm very grateful for the support that I'm getting from my patrons, and it's because of their support that I can keep on publishing videos every week. if you join us over on Patreon, I can also give you something in return for your support. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.